Morning, everybody. We seem to have a nice number of people wanting to participate in this webinar. I'm Helen Roberts from the NSA. I'm the NSA Welsh Development Officer and also wear a number of other hats within NSA as I sell the advertising sheep farmer and run the NSA sheep event, which unfortunately, along with a lot of other events, has been postponed this year. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the principles of feeding sheep. We're lucky to have Nerys Wright from AHDB. Nerys grew up on a beef and sheep farm in Wales and joined AHDB after working in livestock consultant at ADAS and a county advisor of NFU. She has a strong technical background in sheep production, nutrition, body condition scoring, worm control and lameness. And she is currently AHDB's knowledge exchange manager for the South East and East regions. We couldn't have anybody better to start the morning off. We'll try to keep this webinar down to about an hour. Nerys will be running through presentation, and although we will have questions and answers at the end, you can throw some questions in on the Q&A as we go along, and Nerys will pick those up and answer them at the end or as we go along. The chat function is also open for general comments, but please note if you post a question there, it may not be answered. There's a couple of polls for you to participate in as we go along, and you will be prompted when to vote. I'd just like to note that this webinar is open to everybody, not just NSA members. I'd like to make the point that NSA is a membership organisation and that we're highly dependent on our membership as a source of income for us to do our work. We represent members and the UK sheep industry at stakeholder meetings, which include topics such as Brexit, which is obviously becoming very important at the moment, future support scheme, climate change and land marketing. Please have a look at what we do on our website and through our social media channels as we try to keep you up to date with what's going on within the sheep industry. We have different membership brackets and all is explained on the website. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and hand you over to Nerys for what I hope will be an interesting subject.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. No pressure there. Hopefully people tuning in are interested in the subject already. So, right, let's see if I can share my screen successfully. Okay. Oh, I think I've got to put it on. Sorry, apologies, everyone.
No,
you've got to share it before you. Oh gosh, why is that not happening?
Mine works.
There we go. There we go. Is that working for everybody? Sorry, bit of a panic there. Okay. Yeah. Morning, everybody. It's quite unusual not feeding off the audience when you do these sorts of events, because normally you can see people sort of reacting to what you're saying and sort of fidgeting and wanting to ask a question, so you tend to feed on those. So please do ask questions as we go along. If it's really appropriate for that particular slide, Helen will ask it there and then, or she will wait until there's a bit of a sort of a gap. But yeah, Helen's already introduced me. I'm Nerys Wright. I work for AHDB Beef and Lamb, and as you will probably realise after this session, I really enjoy talking about sheep and nutrition. So today I'm not going to go into the depths of going through a ration or real detailed examples of things. This is about setting the scene for the rest of the couple of days, really. There are some other quite specific talks during the day that I will reference as we go along. So we've got one just following this one, actually the Rumenco one, that will talk about some of the options of filling the gap, which I'll come on to. Then there's a detailed ewe colostrum talk as well, I think tomorrow, and a forage analysis and feed labels talk tomorrow as well. So I'm going to touch on those subjects from a brief perspective, so do forgive me, that's why I'm not going into them in such detail. But as I said to Helen, that will also try and maybe keep me on course as well. So today, as I said, I'm going to talk about the principles of feeding sheep. So how the energy requirements change during the year, when the peak requirements are, and then I'll talk a little bit of the consequences of getting it wrong, or really, to follow the theme of today, I should have called it getting it right, because we should look at the positive side of things. And a lot of what I'm going to talk today, I think this is recorded, so will be available afterwards, but there's two manuals that we have at AHDB. One is the Improving Ewe Nutrition for Better Returns. That's more of your sort of generic nutrition manual, and then we've got the much more detailed Feeding the Ewe. That is actually a rewrite of the original 1983 manual, sort of with more recent recommendations in there, and that's downloadable off our website as well. So we call it a manual for consultant vets and producers. Obviously it's available for farmers. It goes into a lot more of the detail of why things happen, so if you're quite interested, do give that a read. I've got a copy on my desk which I've always got to hand. So I just wanted to start with emphasising, let's not forget, and I hope none of this is patronising, because quite often it's just as a reminder, we need to be feeding sheep as if they're ruminants, because that is what they are. And if we think about what our job is, to feed the bugs that live in that rumen, and those bugs will then feed the sheep for us. So that sort of helped me when I was learning about nutrition to think about why some things happen, why, you know, there are some diets we can't manipulate in the way we perhaps like, with greenhouse gas emissions and things like that, and some of that comes down to what the rumen bugs do to the food that we put into the sheep in the first place. Sheep really like a steady, consistent feed to keep going, and I'll talk a little bit more about the pH of the rumen and keeping it stable as we go on. But I know, you know, there's four stomachs, so the rumen and the reticulum, they're not actually fully formed when sheep are born. They only start forming, well, they're there, but they're not functioning. They only start forming and growing once the animal starts eating some sort of hard feed. So the age at which that happens depends massively on when they start nibbling food, so with creep or with grass, but it doesn't actually start functioning right from birth. And when it is fully functioning, that makes up about 85% of the whole of those four chambers, and becomes a really, really important aspect of sheep nutrition. So there's that big transition from birth to that happening. Then you've got the amasum, which basically removes a lot of the water. That's got loads of folds of tissues inside it. And if you like me and you like opening anything that dies on the farm just to have a good look at what it might have died of, that's how you'd recognise the amasum. And then the fourth one is the abomasum, which is basically what we call the true stomach. It's most like ours, and then it sort of folds into the intestine, the small and the large intestine. So apologies if that's something you're not interested in, but it's always good to setting the scene of how things happen and why they happen, basically. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we put into the animal. Now, for those of you who are with it this morning, you'll notice that is a cow or a calf. So that was, that's purpose. But it's just to highlight the complexity of that rumen. So what goes in and then what goes out again. So we start off with fibre. That really is the slow release energy. That's what the rumen needs to keep it ticking over. As I said, it is a ruminant. The bugs can break down the components of that diet that we as humans can't. We can't eat grass and digest it, but the ruminants can, and that's really what we need to focus on, and that's why they're grazing some of the ground that they're grazing. But top of that, and I'll come on to when and why, but the starch and the sugars as well. So the starch is more readily available than fibre. Fibre takes a long while to digest and get the energy out of it. The starch has higher energy. Examples of that would be like cereals in your food. And then you've got the sugar, which is a quick release. Sheep actually have very little requirement for sugar, normally, just a little bit for brain function, apart from in late pregnancy where the lambs have a little bit of a requirement. And we may get talking on to twin lamb disease and things like that as we go on. And you've got rumen degradable protein. So there's two types of protein. There's your rumen degradable and rumen undegradable, or digestible undegradable protein. And the important thing of RDP, and how I think of it, is it goes in as one form of protein. Think of it as Lego, maybe. It goes into the rumen as a type of Lego. The bugs then break it all down into little pieces, which we would call amino acids. And then they come back and make it into another type of Lego stack, which is called microbial protein. And that then passes through the animal and is absorbed in the small intestine. So that is directly broken down by the rumen bugs into a form that they can then use. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as the morning goes on. Trace elements, minerals, I am not going to touch on that as a subject at all. That is a whole day in itself. And I believe there is a talk on that over the next 2 days. I can't remember which day, sorry. So if you're interested in that, please do tune in to the session. I think it's with Pete Bone, isn't it, Helen, I think?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. When is it? Is it tomorrow? Or?
It's another half the state start in the morning.
Right, yeah. So those of you like being up early, there's a good one tomorrow morning. Saliva for buffering. I know that can be a bit, oh yeah, you know, that goes without saying, but that's really important. And it uses about 8 to 10 litres of saliva a day, a sheep. So it's not negligible. Don't forget water. I know some of this you'll be rolling your eyes going, oh, this is so basic, but let's not forget it. It's absolutely crucial, especially in sheep that have just lambed. They do have a higher requirement for water. Now, we rarely see sheep at a stream drinking, but there needs to be water access for sheep most of the time. So all of that goes in. The rumen bugs all do their special job. And then we have the microbial protein that I've already talked about, and then the digestible, undegradable protein that basically goes into the rumen. It's protected, so it can't be broken down by the bugs. And then they both pass out. They're the protein sources that the sheep will use. And then you've got your volatile fatty acids or short chain fatty acids, whatever you want to call them. There are 3 types. You've got propionic, acetic and butyric, and they are sort of made from the different fibre, starch and sugar components of the diet by different rumen bugs, and they then sort of pass over the rumen wall into the animal, and that energy is used for all of the cell functioning and all of the things that the animal needs to survive, basically. So again, apologies for those of you who don't like the science. I love the science, and it helps me remember why things happen. And also, if something goes wrong, I tend to think, well, why is it going wrong? So hopefully that's interesting to most of you. And I've already sort of mentioned maintaining a stable rumen. Those bugs that I've talked about, they're really quite fussy, and they will only work at particular ranges of pH. So without the saliva, just bring that saliva back in again, the rumen pH would be low, about 3, 2.5 to 3, but the saliva keeps it up at a more manageable sort of 6.5, 6.8 level. Now you'll see on that slide, there's a sort of a TMR line there, which is a total mixed ration, which is where, because they're eating the same diet 24/7, there are very little fluctuations. That's assuming it's all mixed well, obviously. And this is just to highlight the effect that feeding concentrates or feeding anything that's got lots of starch in, which changes the pH of the rumen, what effect that has. Again, most of the images I've got are taken from the Feeding the Ewe manual. So, you know, a big plug there. It was written by Leslie Stubbins and Kate Phillips and Jill Povey, who've got lots of experience on sheep nutrition. So it's worth a read. And as you will see, this is why we say to feed low levels of concentrate. And if you're going up to 1 kilo a day, splitting it into 2, ideally, you know, I know I've stood in meetings before and gone, you know, the more regular you can feed a little bit amount, the better. So 3 or 4 times a day feeding would be ideal. But I can see people going, well, that's not practical. So, you know, there's fewer feeds as you can, really, more feeds as you can with the least amount, just to stop that pH of that rumen going up and down. So once it goes below 6, the pH rumen now, we see less or no cellulose digestion. So the digestibility of that forage in the rumen does stop for a function of time while the pH sorts itself out, rebalances, and the rumen bugs start working again. So if we see lots of feed being fed in at once, so if you put a kilo in at one time, that would drop significantly for much longer. And then the ruminants become less efficient in digesting the forage, which is what they're made to do and what we want them to do, really. And it's just also worth remembering as well that these rumen pH, like the bugs, they don't just change overnight. There's a particular balance of different ones for the type of feed they're on. So if you're going to move a diet or move the sheep onto a completely different diet, so you house them from being outside, for example, that's why we say to allow for 7 to 10 days for that rumen to stabilise, for the bug rebalancing to occur, for them to be really working at their optimum levels. So that just gives you some understanding, hopefully, or explanation as to why we talk about giving enough time to adjust the diet. And they're going on to a completely new diet, go on with a full stomach late in the afternoon, or, you know, those sorts of tips. So really on to the basic building blocks of sheep nutrition then, just to sort of highlight. So I'm just having a look at time just to make sure I haven't got run away with myself already. Just to talk about the two basic building blocks of sheep nutrition. Now, some people might disagree with me here, but I think if you get these two right, a lot of the other things will fall into place. And yes, you've got your trace elements coming in, and yes, you've got other things coming in, but you get these two bits right and we're on a good start. And those two, as you've probably guessed, if I was in a room, I'd ask you all to shout out what they are. But one is the energy, which we call metabolizable energy. We talk about that in megajoules. So when I come on to talking about the amount of energy they have in a little while, I'll be talking about megajoules. Then the metabolizable protein, and I've talked about those two different types of protein as well. And I'll talk about when they become more important just as we get into the different times of year. So we get those two right. And a lot of the things we tend to see at lambing time and later in the year that just aren't right, they tend to fix themselves. But we don't have an infinite amount of food that we can physically eat. We need to match what those sheep what they need to what they can physically eat in a day. It's not infinite. You know, the rumen needs time to digest the food. And we call that dry matter intake. So how much they can physically eat in a day. So I'll focus mostly on energy, but let's not forget protein as well. And just to give you some idea, now these are very, very crude figures. They will vary a little bit with different sheep, but this gives you a rule of thumb just to think about how much a sheep can eat. So if you're rationing or you're trying to work out how much food to give a sheep, this will give you an idea of where to start. Always watch how that goes, you know, in terms of if you've worked it out that it's X amount and they're in a shed and it's all gone by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, then you need to consider upping it. We need to be having feed in front of sheep at all time, especially if they're housed and heavily pregnant. But I just wanted to highlight here, so a dry ewe, so you've weaned her, her dry matter intake, I can't remember if I said, it's all based on how big that sheep is. So it's based on their body weight. So it's about 1.5% of her body weight. So knowing what the weight of your sheep is a great start. I always talk about the 70 kilo ewe, but in fact, how many of those are actually around? So if you're wanting to tweak your rations, it might be worth weighing all, if not a proportion of your sheep to see where you're at there. But interestingly, I'll talk as we go on now about the energy requirements, how they go up. As that sheep has an increase in energy requirements, so does her dry matter intake increase. So in late pregnancy, she'll be able to eat up to 2.5% of her body weight. With some rations, we've done some trials, you know, we've seen that up over 3%. So we just sort of need to just remember that, yes, the energy requirements of ewes increase. And I think we're perhaps tempted to think, oh yeah, but they've got so much lamb inside them, they haven't got enough space. That there's an element of that comes in, but actually the rumen does become a lot more efficient. So let's keep feeding it with the forage and maximise that. Obviously into lactation, it goes up to 3.5, and they've got loads more space at that point as well. So I'll come on to late pregnancy in a bit, but let's try and keep away from the tendency of perhaps throwing too much concentrate at them in late pregnancy to fill that gap, because they can do really well from forage. Sorry, Helen, were you going to say something?
We have got a question that's come in, Nerys. If percentage intake is based on body weight, why are dry ewes so much lower?
It tends to come down to the fact that they don't have that requirement. So a dry ewe, her maintenance requirement is about 8-9 megajoules just to sustain. We do know that ewes that are thin will eat a lot more. So if you've weaned them and they need to gain a lot of condition to tupping and you put the food in front of them, they can do that. So like I said, it's a really crude figure, but their maintenance requirements are a lot lower, but they can eat some more. Thin sheep in particular love to eat if you put it in front of them.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so actually I was going to ask there, does any, time for questions? If there's no others, do you want me to move on? That really is just setting the scene. So we're going to come now on to talking a little bit about particular times of year that might be more appropriate to people. This is where the first poll was, Helen. I'm going to really put this, do I give this to you now to run the poll?
Is this the ewe condition and fertility?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay.
So I just wanted to sort of, first of all, check you're still there, everybody. Check you're listening. But just also gauge listeners' thoughts. At what time of the year do you think ewe condition affects fertility the most? And we can talk about scanning results, because that would be probably the first line in the sand of where we know the year's going. So I'd be interested just to hear people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's quite a fair percentage of people responding.
Ooh, right, brilliant. If everyone says none of the above, then obviously.
At the moment, you've not got any in there, so you're
right,
okay.
That's okay. Do we give it more time, Helen, or?
I'll just give it the full minute and then...
Yeah, that's fine, that's fine.
Okay, I'm going to end it now. Can you see those results on the screen?
Oh, here we go.
There you go.
Oh, it's close. Okay. Oh, yeah, so brilliant. None of the above, nobody said that. So, but it is a biased sample, obviously, because everybody listening hopefully has an interest in sheep nutrition to start with. Only 2% think that scanning or condition at scanning affects scanning results. 24% think all of the above. And then we've got 35% think the condition at tupping. And interestingly, most of you, by a small majority, 39% thinking that it started, that ewe condition weaning last year affects fertility scanning the most. So that's really interesting. I'm going to sort of come on to that as we go on, but yeah, I would probably agree that all of them to a degree do, but it's quite interesting that so many of you think that weaning last year also has an effect as well, so that longer term effect of ewe condition on scanning. So I'll come on to that as we go on. Can I close that?
I think if I stop sharing.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, brilliant. So has any questions come in, Helen, or shall I keep going?
No, we're still, still on that one question, so.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay. Now, I know I've seen some of the names of people on the call. There's many of you I don't know, but there's many of you I do know. And you probably know I cannot talk about nutrition without mentioning body condition scoring. We started we'll call it the KPI project at AHDB back in 2014, looking at the effect of body condition scoring on flock performance. So we looked at it from a perspective of scanning results, So how many, you know, if a ewe becomes pregnant, and then if she does become pregnant, how many lambs is she pregnant with? Following that through to lambing, and then following that all the way through to the weaning of those lambs. And we did it for almost 4 full production years, ending in 2016. And I'm trying to finish a PhD on this subject. So hopefully, and many of you are like, you've been saying this for 4 years, Nerys, just get on with it. But hopefully submitting before Christmas. And then there'll be sort of no stopping talking about body condition score after that. But I just wanted to highlight, you know, that circle and how body condition score does, you know, it doesn't just stop at one point and start again. It does have a much longer term effect on ewe productivity, and 39% of you recognise that the condition at weaning does affect what happens the following scanning. So I know it's difficult when we've got years where we've got no grass to sort of say feed them now because you've got to part with that money, but it will actually pay dividends by the time you get to scanning of the next year. It's just difficult because you write the check and you don't necessarily know how that's helping you in the long run. But we'll sort of mention now, I'll start at tupping because it's that appropriate time of year. You know, most of you, you've got your tups in if you've not got your teasers in, or you're thinking about it. Some of you may be lambing, but that'll be few and far between. So the focus really is to have that ewe at the right condition score, ideally 3 to 3.5 at tupping. And yeah, I was going to move the slide. So for a lowland sheep, we'd aim for say 3 to 3.5, ideally 3.5. But just wanted to emphasise that really is not about a flock average, because if you've got a flock average of 3, you could have a lot at 2 and you could have a lot at 4. So it's really about targeting that individual ewe as well. So I cannot advocate enough putting your hand on those sheep as often as you can, just to see how they're going. Now, how you record that data is up to you. You know, many of you could do it all fancy dancy and fully ID, put the score in and see what it was last time and see quarter changes. Or you could just do what my dad does, which is she's okay, she's thin, she's a bit fit, and do it that way and just siphon them off in that way. And again, when we're at tupping, inevitably I will get 1 or 2 phone calls most of, you know, this time of year going, my sheep are, you know, there's a few of them a bit thin, they're about to go into the tup, what can I do? And it's not particularly helpful if my answer is go back in time 6 to 8 weeks and feed them then, because that's not helpful. But that really is, you know, our production year, our scanning percent, which is the sort of like first barometer of how the year is going to go, starts back at weaning, if not before weaning really, but at the point of weaning. And I'll come on to weaning at the end of the talk. But you know, we need to be really looking after our sheep, not letting them get too thin at weaning, because it takes a lot to gain that condition. But actually some of the things I'm finding in my PhD is suggesting that we cannot undo that damage, even if we can gain that condition between weaning and tupping, because the follicles have already been set 6 months ago. So there is that element to take into consideration as well. I get asked about flushing quite a lot. And there are benefits to it most definitely, but really take care with it. It really ought to be a backup plan. So flushing is that rising plane of nutrition by giving them that higher sort of flush of grass or a bit of feed in the sort of few weeks leading up to tupping. But do take care with that, and definitely don't hold them back to purposely flush them. You know, the focus should be getting the weight and the body condition score right. And flushing should be a backup plan for those of you who perhaps don't make it to where you'd like them to be. We know there's little effect of flushing in ewes that are already at good body condition score, which is why, you know, it doesn't necessarily make a difference of those ewes 3, 3.5. But if we're going to flush ewes that are condition score 2, what we could inevitably end up with is a lot of thin ewes with twins or triplets. And that's not really ideal, because they are where we're going to see potentially more twin lamb disease and issues around lambing and mortality. So quite often I will say, if you've got sheep at condition score 2 at tupping, look at the cull ewe price and wonder, do you actually put them to the tup? And again, this is textbook, but do be considering how many you've got, but it's worth considering. You know, will they make it through the year? So you're better off getting rid of them as a cull than paying to get rid of them at fallen stock if they struggle. So that's what I was going to talk about in terms of mating. Has any questions come in about that? Because it's obviously quite a timely time of year, but it's really about that preparation, a few weeks leading up to it. And if they're not quite there's a few things we can do, but
we've just got a question, which is why should there be different body condition targets for lowland, upland and hill sheep?
Yeah, and we get asked this quite a lot, and I think my sort of thought process is always, it depends on what you're expecting them to rear. You know, if you're if you're upland but you've got a lowland breed and quite a prolific scanning percentage, then aim for 3.5. But a lot of it tends to be, if you're expecting a single or you're scanning at 1.2, 1.3, they're not going to need that amount of condition because they're not under so much pressure, because they're not rearing so many lambs. So that's why there's the difference. And we've split them into those categories because it's fairly simple, but look at your farming system. And like I say, if you've got more of a lowland breed, but you're classed as upland, go for the lowland target. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question. Okay, so mid-pregnancy then. This time of year, we can't really impact mating, but I'm going to talk about sort of what we do between now and scanning and how that can have an impact on flock productivity. Now, I'm not going to overly talk about the benefits of scanning. I'm assuming that most, if not all of people listening will be pregnancy scanning. It was interesting when we were updating this 1983 manual, I say we, I read the old version, the MLC one, and it said in it about this new technology called pregnancy scanning. And there was a sentence in it that said, at 50p a ewe, this is unlikely to ever be a cost-effective option for sheep farmers. And I just remember thinking, wow, how have we come on? Because it certainly is cost effective, but secondly, it hasn't actually gone up in price very much in those 37 years. No. And I know it's 37 years because that's the year I was born. So, it's just quite interesting. Now, people want to ask about questions about pregnancy scanning, go on ahead. But I don't want to go through the basics if everybody listening is doing it. But it tells us so much information. It can help us get rid of sheep that are not pregnant if you want to. So if you're quite a prone area for drought through the summer, you're not carrying ewes, they're not doing anything for you. It tells you a lot about how your sort of tupping period has gone. So I'll leave it at that, but just you can probably tell I'm a massive advocate. The other thing I just wanted to say was I quite often get asked, how accurate is scanning? It's as accurate as your scanner. Some very experienced operators can date them, within how many days pregnant they are. So really it's about having an experienced operator. And if you are having issues with your scanning results, go back to the operator and tell them, because they might not know that they're not getting it right. And how can they improve if they don't know? So that's the only thing I was going to add. So we talk about maintaining diet throughout. So that first month when they've been tupped, for the first months after that, the embryo hasn't implanted. It's still really quite vulnerable to a lot of things. It's vulnerable to stress. It's vulnerable, and by stress we mean any extreme weather. So if we happen to have a huge amount of snow as those tups are in or have been in for a month, that can produce enough stress that can stop that embryo implanting. Sudden changes to feed as well. So that's why we say if you're feeding them up to tupping, and keeps them feeding throughout tupping. And then historically, there's always been this sort of, if you tup them at 3.5, you can let them lose half a condition score up to scanning. Now, we love doing this. We love changing our minds. So as you'll see on the sort of the circular body condition score scan there, what I'm finding, I think it's based on my PhD, is that actually maintaining body condition score and ewe weight up to scanning will actually have a positive effect on flock performance. So that is all the way through. So ewes that are at higher body condition score at scanning and the ewes that maintain or gain weight from tupping to scanning have more ewes pregnant than barren. They have higher litter sizes. They have more lambs born, but then they would have more lambs born because they've got more scanned. So we just need to take that with a bit of caution. But also it has a positive effect on lamb growth rates to 8 weeks and to weaning as well. Now, the sort of research that loss was based upon is based upon sort of the thought process that if they have a little bit of mild undernutrition, the placenta, the blood flow to the placenta overcompensates for that and produces a bigger placenta. So the lambs aren't sort of affected in any way, and that they're born sort of heavier with more and more viable. So it's not that that's incorrect. It's just if you look at the sort of other aspects of it, from a fertility perspective and a lamb growth perspective, that loss isn't necessarily now what perhaps we're thinking is the best thing to do. So and that also does depend on the starting body condition score, but that always did. So if you were already under condition score at tupping, the advice was always do not let them lose any more. So we really do need to look at that feeding during the tupping and scanning time to make sure they're not losing too much condition. I think one of the reasons for that as well is that if they lose it before scanning, it's not there for the rest of the year, and that we possibly need it in lactation rather than earlier on. So that's just something worth bearing in mind going the next sort of couple of months about trying to maintain that body condition score and how you can do that going forward.
We've got a couple of questions on the scanning, Nerys.
Oh, yeah, brilliant.
What is the range of weeks that is best to scan for?
Okay, so we'd some would say you could go as low as 50, but I'd normally say it's around the sort of 70 to 80 days. If you go too early, you might not spot them, but if you go too late, what you will see is you will see that they're pregnant, but you won't see how many are there. So I would say between 60, 70, 80 days from when your tups went in would be the ideal day. Yeah. And obviously, if you're rattling and things like that, that'll give you some idea. Yeah. And if you take your tups out, I know that sounds really patronising, but take your tups out as well, because you'll know the latest they can be. We don't want July-born lambs; they're just a pain. So from that midpoint, so I would say 60 to 80.
Yeah, I'd sort of agree with that. We've just recently scanned at home, and when the scanner man's in his crate and he goes 3, and I'm going, that's not definite. No, we better say 4. I can't.
Oh God.
Yeah, but never mind. Right. The other question is, could the bigger lamb size in a thinner ewe be related to condition of ewe's dam during pregnancy? You are what your grandmother ate.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work on, the fancy word for that is epigenetics. I'm not sure about the size of the lamb, but I've just been updating my lit review, and there's things out there about how what your grandmother was fed will affect how fertile you are and all those sorts of things. So, we talk about last year's weaning having an effect on scanning. There's also some research out there that does suggest what we feed the sheep will affect their kids and their kids after that. So, that's why it is so important. So I'm not there, and there is heritability of lamb growth rate. It's only about 10 or 15% because the environmental factors take over that. But it's definitely something worth considering.
And we have a forage crop growing for ewes to go onto as tups come out, 4-week tupping period. Will this be a risky move because of the change of diet?
It's about putting them on, it'll be the things like put them on there when they're full. So don't do it first thing in the morning when they've got an empty stomach and they're starving, they just gorge on it. So there are some practical tips we would give there. So as I say, put them on late in the afternoon when they're full so they can sort of start eating it. And so 4-week tupping period, Yeah, and if it's something you've already done and they're used to it, it won't be such a shock. But just bear in mind how you introduce it. I don't know if you're going to strip graze it or if you're just going to let them loose, but it's just worth considering how you put them on there.
Okay, and another one's just come in. What are the effects of ewes with higher condition scores at tupping? Ours haven't been fed anything for years, and this year are very fit on next to no grass. I can't see a way of reducing the intake. And we would have I'd agree with the question that's come in. Ours have gone very fit just lately on, you know, a lot of grass, but nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd always sort of say, well, what's your definition of very fit? Because up to about condition score 4, we call it curvilinear. So we see that the litter, the scanning rate will go up, up, up and up to a point where it becomes detrimental. I can't see myself, so I don't know if you can see what I'm doing. And then it will start dropping off. So very fat ewes, which I would say 4 and above, so your 4.5 and your 5s, what we do tend to see the scanning rates drop off there. And that's because of sort of higher embryonic death, sort of to do with all of the things circulating in the blood. So it doesn't really necessarily affect the ovulation rate. That still increases, but it tends to affect what in plants. But again, I quite often get the question of, do I hold them back now? They're about to go into the tup, do I hold them back? Well, that's a tricky one because you don't want them in a negative energy balance and mobilizing body fat when they're about to go in with a tup. So unless they're overly fat, and then obviously just keep an eye on them during that mid-pregnancy stage. So they're probably the types that don't need to gain body condition score between tupping and scanning, but that maintenance. And again, don't overfeed them in late pregnancy, but don't underfeed them either, because I'll come on to late pregnancy next, I think. But yeah, there's very little you can do apart from during that sort of weaning and tupping period where you could perhaps be a little bit tighter on them. But if they're magically putting weight on nothing, then there's very little you can do. So unless they're over 4, I wouldn't overly worry.
Okay.
Make sure you've got small hands at lambing time if they're over 4.5. You can get the lambs out.
And just one more question before we do move on then. Equally, if they tap on roots, how can you deal with putting tups in and therefore changing tups diet dramatically?
Yeah, so with tups, it's interesting. Again, they will have a rumen in the same way, so they will need to adjust. But once they're in with those ewes, their priority is not necessarily what they're eating, it's what they're getting up to. And we'll always expect rams to lose 10-15% of their body weight during tupping anyway, because they're just so incredibly busy. So again, it comes back to make sure that, so we'd say with tups, be at condition score 4 at tupping. Make sure that they're at that condition, and keep an eye on them. Really, there's very little you can do. If you're going to start feeding them, then obviously they're unlikely to come to the food, or they're going to get distracted from their job. So I wouldn't overly worry about that, because we know that they will lose weight during that period anyway. Just don't let them lose more than a condition score.
Yeah, and there is just one more question, and then I'm going to let Nerys move on. Can tupping be done on regrowth of mixed culture field, vetch, rape and barley? Could it develop any nutrient deficiencies?
Oh gosh, the quick answer to that is I don't know about nutrient deficiencies. There's so much we still don't know about. I don't want to call it alternative grazing, but there's still a lot we don't know about different crops. So we know there's sort of an iodine deficiency on root crops because of the goitrogens and things like that, but I'm not sure. Can you save that question, Helen, and I can look into it and ask?
Yeah, certainly, and it might be one for Peter tomorrow morning well.
Yeah, absolutely.
With his trace elements.
Yeah, absolutely.
If the person's able to tune in tomorrow or look at Peter's recording, I'll try and get the question to Peter beforehand as well.
I'm sure that will be a question Peter will be asked. It's one a lot of us want to know. Like, we know a lot about, like I say, on the root crops and the iodine, but what about others? There's a lot we don't know about those. And it's about knowing a bit about what your farm tends to be deficient in anyway already, and will the alternative crops exasperate that or cure some of that? Is probably your question, and I'm just asking it back to you in a different way. Okay, right, I'm keeping my own time. Okay, so late pregnancy then. This, I feel this is probably the time where we've talked about feeding. You know, we do a lot of talk specifically on late pregnancy feeding, on a lot of rations, and perhaps we haven't focused so much on the earlier stages. But just as a reminder why it's so important, this is when 75% of those lamb growth actually takes place. It's when the udder development happens. So we know that the nutrition in late pregnancy sets that udder development and will determine what she can produce in lactation. And also the importance of colostrum. Now we've got a colostrum talk over the next 2 days, so I'm not going to overly talk about that. And the immune system as well. Ewes that are fed well will have a better immune system. Their immune system does sort of drop a little bit on the approach to lambing because it gets diverted into milk production. But ewes that are fed well tend to recover from that quite quickly after lambing, basically. So I'm quite tight on time, but I didn't know if I was going to have time to talk about worm control here. I'm not going to touch on it, but if we've got time at the end, I might come back to sort of the benefits of, you know, feeding sufficient protein and energy and the positive impact that can have on a ewe's ability to dampen down worm control at lambing. So if I've got time, I'll come back to that. And I've already sort of made reference to the fact, let's not be tempted to feed a sheep like a pig in late pregnancy and just throw loads of concentrate at her, because we know that her rumen does become more efficient. So apologies, this is a busy slide, but I just wanted, and again, it's in the Feeding the Ewe manual, just wanted to highlight what the energy requirements are and how they change. So if we look at 70 kilo ewe here with twins, just for ease, her energy requirement 7 weeks before she lambs is just over 11 megajoules. By the time she's a week before lambing, it's all the way up to 18. So it's almost half again in 6 weeks. So we do see that energy requirement upping over time as those lambs are growing and udder development takes place. So I just wanted to talk about that. And we really aim to have ewes lambing at around body condition score 3, so that they've got that body fat there for when they need it. And again, so I'm not going to overly talk about forage, because I know we've got GLW talking about interpreting a forage analysis, but maximising forage, but also grass. It's not just about, you know, forage. We double the cost the minute we conserve it in any way. So priority would be grass, then any conserved forage. We know that the quality varies massively, not just between the year, it varies between a field and sometimes parts of a field. But really, let's make the most. That is where we're going to keep our costs down where possible, and cost is something we really need to be looking at over the next few years. So I know it might not be something you want to do, but calculate how much you've got for the winter, how much forage, and then what is the quality of it. So you'd have to analyse it, and you can get lots of analyses done for free. And then if you listen to the talk on interpreting it, it then gives you some idea of what to look for, because you get an A4 sheet with loads of different colours all over it, with all those fancy words on, but you only need to look at 5 key things really, and that will tell you what you need to know. And then what we do is, based on how much quality you've got, how much quantity you've got, you pick your supplement based on that gap, basically. And I don't want that to sound patronising, because it just sounds so obvious, but you know, we tend to get a little bit stuck in a sort of a cycle of going for the same feed every year when actually we might not need it. So in a year where we've got a lot of forage that's good quality, let's try and reap some of the money back from the years where we've had poor quality silage and we've had to feed more. So that's what I was going to talk about in terms of forage. So if you want to know what those key things to look at are, then listen to the GLW feed, I think is tomorrow. And so don't forget, you know, grass, this is not just about forage. Grass is a key one to look at as well, in terms of quality and quantity, and alternative crops as well. Compound feed, again, the compound feed talk is going to be covered tomorrow. But But I just wanted to just say a few things. I've already said it needs to reflect the forage that you're feeding. We do get very stuck in a vicious circle of feeding the same feed from the same feed merchant every year and not changing it, when actually the gap that we have to fill, which is what a sheep needs, what forage you've got, and what's the difference, will change year on year depending on how good your forage is, as I've already said. And please shop around, go to different feed merchants, ask for the ingredients that make up the compound feed and what are they. So way back 45 minutes ago, I talked about that fibre, starch and sugar. There's a good table in this Feeding the Ewe book that breaks down, are those ingredients falling into the fibre category, the sugar category or the starch category. What we don't want is loads of fibre in your compound feed, because you get that from your forage. You need more of the sugar and the starch. So look for those ingredients. And, you know, I've heard a lot of people, feed merchants tell me that quite often they get dictated, I'm not paying more than £200 a tonne, so make it £200 a tonne. I'm not paying 210, make it 200 or 160 or whatever it is. So there you have to substitute an ingredient to make it stack up. So it might actually be worth paying that extra £10 a tonne, but you might end up feeding a little bit less of it over the entire period. So that's the sort of thing to think about. And you absolutely pay for what you get. And I'm independent, so I can say that. It would probably be harder for the feed company tomorrow to say that, but you do pay for what you get. So shop around, ask for the ingredients list, and also just be respectful. If you do get ingredient lists from some companies, don't share them with other companies, because that will just make that particular company not share it with other people in the future. There are sort of legal tolerances on what has to be on the bag, and ME, which is the energy, is not one of those. So you will have to ask for that information. So I harp on about 12.5 ME compound feed. It's never on the bag. So it's up to us to ask that question. Okay, so I'm not going to focus too much on that, just in the interest of time, but if anyone's got any questions, we'll see if we can get to those. In following the theme of today, how do we know if we're getting it right? So in late pregnancy, we can do blood samples pre-lambing. Don't do them too soon before lambing, because they're not really under that much pressure. If you do it too close to lambing, you'll be a bit stuck as to what you can do. So I'd say about 3 weeks before lambing, get your vet in to take the blood. So BHB is a byproduct of fat mobilization. So if they're breaking down fat to meet their energy requirements, you'll have a high BHB level. And then your urea and albumin are indicators of long and short-term protein. So they're the 3 things I would ask for in the lead up to lambing. And, you know, Pete tomorrow might mention about trace elements. Obviously, I'm going to say regular condition scoring, heavily biased there. But I know there'll be a lot of experienced stockmen on the thing going, I know when my sheep are thin, but we can detect changes in condition score by hand at about a quarter unit, and we'll detect it before we can see it by our eye, just because the fleece hides a multitude of sins. And then the other thing we can do is just monitor flock performance. So ewe mortality, you know, are we having lots of prolapses? Are we having lots of twin lamb? Are we having mastitis? They're all related back to nutrition as well. And then lamb survival, so birth weight, colostrum, they'll all be covered in the colostrum talk, and then moving on to lamb growth rate. So a short poll, sorry, I didn't think I was ever going to fill an hour. Just very quickly, if we could just do the next poll, Helen, please. Looking at, so now this is focusing on lamb growth rates to weaning. Is there a particular time of year that we think ewe condition affects that the most? You'll notice I haven't put all or none, because there was just too many options. The options are tupping, weaning last year, lambing, scanning, or during that lactation period.
I haven't got, it's coming up as the
previous one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, maybe I didn't make it clear there was 2. Not to worry, that might save us anyway, because I've only got 8 minutes to go. But if people want to type it in the text just to give an idea of what you're thinking, then we can at least have a look at that. Just for the last period then, and I know like lambing, seems forever away. But really, what a ewe produces and the performance of that lamb is a key indicator. Well, the performance of a lamb is a key indicator of how that ewe is milking. So a ewe will hit her peak milk yield per day at 3 to 4 weeks after she's lambed. So you can probably see here, let me get the arrow, you can see from sort of 1 week from giving birth, it rises sort of 3, and then it actually reduces thereafter naturally. That's just natural, you know, evolution. What she produces in that sort of 3 to 4 weeks is actually 50% of what she produces over the whole lactation period. So feeding that ewe, or how much body fat she's got, depending on, you know, where you're at, in those first 4 weeks is absolutely crucial for that lamb to grow going forward. Energy requirements. I know this is again a really busy slide, but I just wanted to highlight how they change. So, you know, we've got, and these are all off AFRC, you can get this book off Amazon, depends on how much milk they're producing every day. But let's go to the very extreme and say we've got a ewe that's producing 3 kilos a day and we don't want her to mobilize any weight. She's only 60 kilos. She needs 32 megajoules of energy a day. And if you think back to late pregnancy, I know she was 70 kilos and we're not comparing like for like, but she needed 18. So I know 18 and 18 is 36, but you're almost doubling what a ewe would need in lactation. So I feel we get late pregnancy feeding, you know, we get the principles, we do put a lot of focus on, but let's not forget that nutrition once they've lambed. You know, if we turn them out to lots and lots of grass, then obviously that job is done for us. However, in years where grass growth is a bit slow or it's incredibly wet, you know, they'll be filling up on water. You know, let's look at what we can do, what we can provide them to give them that little bit of a helping hand, just to help in that first four weeks to get that lamb growth really, really running. So 8 weeks post lambing, we put this into the KPI project. You know, they do it at Signet and other recording services to look at lamb performance. And 8 weeks is really an indicator of how well that ewe has produced milk. So set yourself a target to what you'd like your lambs to be at 8 weeks. In the KPI project, we used 20 kilos, but they were lowland farms. So for some lowland farms, that's too low. You need to be nearer 23, 24. And for some, it should be 18. But set a target, weigh your lambs at 8 weeks. I mean, ideally 4 weeks, but they're a bit young and probably a bit flighty. So, you know, whenever you can. Assess ewe condition at the same time. But then one of the things that's coming out of my PhD is looking at, use that 8 week condition and lamb weight to determine when you wean. Because I know weaning can often be a date in the diary that falls between many other jobs, which I absolutely get, but there'll be some years where it should be sooner because the ewes are struggling, there's not a lot of feed, lambs and ewes are competing, and we're just going to have a knock-on effect for next year, basically. So that's why we sort of put 8 weeks in, just to see, you know, did it give us any useful information? And it has given us a lot of information. And one of the key things is using that, as I said, to determine when you wean. So the recommendation is you wean at 12 weeks or 90 days. For some, it would be sooner. Perhaps your ewe lambs would be sooner. Thin ewes would be sooner. We did a survey last year again now, just to sort of get some idea of what people are doing. There's still quite a lot weaning at 14 to 16 weeks. Which on some circumstances will be fine, but like I said, if you're competing, if the lambs and the ewes are competing for grass, you know, there comes a point where you draw a line and say, right, my focus now is these lambs and these ewes for next year, and go from there.
We've got a couple of questions, Nerys.
Yeah, that's fine. It's my last slide. So
okay. When do you consider the effect of the ewe on lamb growth to decrease and the sire effect to take over?
Yeah, so that is a good question. In the pilot study that we analysed this data, so we did year 1 and then we did year 2, 3 and 4, we were looking at the effect of the ewe, oh gosh, I can't remember which way around it was now. I think the effect of the sire kicked in after 8 weeks. I think I'd have to check it. But we didn't look specifically at individual sires in years 2, 3 and 4 because a lot weren't single sire mating. So we know that the effect of the ewe is massive up to 8 weeks, and that I think the sire then kicked in after that, if my memory serves me right.
Okay. A lot of work done with testing dairy cows' colostrum with a refractometer. Has there been any new work done with used colostrum? Is there any ideal figure?
We've definitely done some on beef. AHDB, we funded a project on beef. I think that's a question for, is it Kat tomorrow, the MSD lady, the colostrum question?
Probably.
Yeah, I wouldn't know a figure off the top of my head, but I know we encourage to look at that, but I think we'd ask that tomorrow. Sorry, that's a bit of a politician's answer.
And another question, most lambed indoors are turned out immediately after lambing, and albeit that they may continue to receive some concentrate, is there any suggestion that rumen microfloras struggle for a period to adapt to this dietary change?
They may well do. I mean, they'll obviously be going from a forage to a grass, so it's not, you know, it's not as extreme as some changes could be. And if the concentrate is being dropped out of the diet, then that will stop those pH fluctuations. I think one of the important things to note there is that, you know, the minute the ewe lambs, her appetite increases almost immediately. So make sure they've got access to whatever feed they can indoors ad lib so they don't run out. And then when they are turned out, if there isn't enough grass or you know, feed what they would be used to, consider that continuing that supplementation or providing forage of some description. And I know that's going to add cost, and it might be that you haven't got any forage left because you haven't conserved enough and you've just got through lambing, but that is something worth considering, because they can milk off their backs if the condition is there, body condition is there, but equally if the body condition skill isn't there and the feed isn't there, that is going to have a knock-on effect on lamb growth rates, most definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to summarise. As I said right at the beginning, we feed the rumen bugs, they feed the sheep. You know, the most cost-effective way of feeding those sheep is grazing and forage. Think about the energy and the protein first. A lot of conversations I have when I sort of say, well, what are you feeding your sheep? I normally ask the audience now, what do you think the first answer I get is? And I always get told the protein content. Oh, I'm an 18% protein or 20% protein. But actually, let's look at the energy as well, because if they haven't got the energy in the diet, that protein just comes out the back end. And yeah, my bias to condition scoring is completely obvious, but it does have a long-term effect, as I've already alluded to. So weaning of last year has a knock-on effect all the way to scanning, but also to the following lamb crop. And let's think about utilising 8 week as a sort of milestone to look at ewe performance, but also look at how we can determine that how we can use that to determine weaning as well.
Lovely.
There we go. That was me thinking I'd never fill an hour. I don't know how I was thinking that. So I hope people have found that useful. Yeah.
I think so. Much. I think we've got some questions. Yes, the slides will be available. Well, the slides obviously will be available through watching this webinar again.
I can PDF them if you want, Helen, and send them over to you if somebody specifically wants them, but they'd have to be PDF'd.
Yeah, that sounds fine to me. I think I've heard that. I know the lady that's just asked for them. So if you drop me an email, and I can forward those on.
Yeah.
Somebody said very good presentation. Thank you. I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And I would like to thank AHDB for sponsoring this, and Nerys for taking the time to talk to us this morning. We will, obviously, this will be available on our website to look at again. And if anybody's got any suggestions going forward for other webinars that you'd like NSA to be involved in, please let us know. and we hope to catch up with you all soon, and stay safe and take care. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Bye.